Hello and welcome to your weekly roundup of all the latest news and ramble about what we've been driving and doing from the team at electrifying.com. So this week, when is a Jeep not a Jeep? We'll be coming up with a punchline to that one. And in a absolutely mad week for electric car launches, we're going to be discussing the Peugeot E3008 reveal, along with the new Hyundai Kona. And we send the tallest member of the team to drive the smallest electric car in the world. Plus, I'll be asking, are you a real man if you like electric cars? So, welcome to the Kilowatt Half Hour. I am Ginny and I'm joined by Tom and by Mike.
Hello.
Hello, both of
Hello.
you.
Hello.
Hello.
It has been a mad week. We've been everywhere. Nicola's not with us today. She's probably off on another launch still. She has been off driving the BYD Dolphin in the UK, and we'll be chatting to her next week about that. But just quickly, chats, where have you been? Tom, where have you been?
I've been in Czechia, which is the country formerly known as the Czech Republic, driving the new Kona Electric. Quite a lot. I drove the big battery version this time and saw the factory where it was made.
Ooh, I have questions about that because I really like that car. Haven't driven it yet, but I think they've done a very nice job with it. And Mike, what about you? Well, we sent you off to drive a ridiculous car, didn't we?
Well, yeah, I was in France, which is formerly known as France, and we've all seen a lot of airports this week, haven't we? We've all spent most of our time has been spent in departure lounges. But yeah, I've been to France, just outside Paris, to go and drive the extended battery Citroen EC4 and EC4X and the Ami buggy as well.
And I have also been in France, in a place that I find it hard to pronounce. Sochaux. That's really bad, isn't it? Apologies to anyone who's French. It's basically home to Peugeot's factory and where the forthcoming Peugeot E3008 will be built, and they were very proud about it all. So we saw the reveal of that car. It's an interesting car, isn't it, you two? Because it's potentially got an absolutely massive range, 435 miles of official range. And I don't know about you, but I always really cringe when, marketing speak generally makes me cringe. But when car companies, or anybody indeed, says it's next level, it's, groundbreaking, but next level particularly makes my teeth grind, and I don't like that at all. And there was a lot of next level going on over in France for me at the start of the week. But it is interesting because, actually that range is pretty much next level. I mean, it's got a massive battery. It's got a 98 kilowatt hour battery in that version, which is whopping. Which, if you put that into perspective, it's like twice the size of, well, probably all the other batteries used in Stellantis' electric cars, I would say, isn't it? 52 kilowatts in some of them. I don't know. What do you two think of it?
Well, I kind of looked at that press release and went, 430 miles, is that right? Have they got kilometres? Is it wrong? But no, I mean, that is huge, and that's going to give people real confidence, isn't it? I do wonder if a car of that size needs a battery that big, though, but I don't know, maybe as an initial stage, it's what we need to have to get people to make the switch.
No, I think it's interesting so much as this is the first car that's on that Stella platform, they call it, don't they? Which is the new, up to this point, every electric car from the Stellantis group has always been on a slightly adapted petrol and diesel internal combustion engine car platform. This is the first one that's built the other way round. It's built for electric, but it can accommodate internal combustion and hybrid. So this is the first kind of proper car. And if they're coming in with a 400-mile range car, then that's, it bodes well for all the other stuff that's going to be swung off that platform. So yeah, I thought it was interesting.
It does, yeah. They had that platform there, and as you say, it's quite a feat for Peugeot to get it because there's a lot of brands in the Stellantis family that would have been vying for that. And that was really what they were talking about, was that it's all about sort of charging times, performance, efficiency, that will offer. There's a second battery as well in the range, 73 kilowatt hour battery. It's going to offer around 326 miles of range. So I was doing the sums on those, and you're going to have to be averaging 4.4 miles per kilowatt hour in order to get anywhere near those. In my experience of Stellantis cars and Peugeots in particular, because I ran an E208 for a while, that's massively punchy, I would say. I'm not saying they're not going to be able to do it, but it's going to be very interesting looking at that in the real world, because they're not the most efficient, are they?
I
Well,
think
yeah,
that's
but you look
changing
at
though.
that Astra that I drove, which
Yeah.
is on the new platform and has the new engines and the new battery. And I wasn't trying hard. I was just driving normally on the motorway, did maybe 300 miles in it, and it averaged 5 miles per kilowatt hour, which is, I've never driven anything that efficient, and I wasn't really trying. So, I mean, the weather was quite nice, I suppose, but uh, I think it might actually do it. Maybe they've learnt their lesson on that, your 208 and things, and it will actually be that good.
Yeah, I mean, I drove the EC4X with the extended range on this launch, and again, they made a big fuss about the fact that the drivetrain and the regen and everything has all been fine-tuned, and they're making quite significant gains in terms of efficiency from those early cars. And I drove mine for an hour, a bit of motorway, a bit of back road, bit of countryside, and it was 4.5, 4.6 miles per kilowatt hour, and I wasn't taking it particularly easy. Um, and I think if that's rolled out across the group, those efficiencies. I mean, we were driving in the middle of summer, so we've got to caveat that, and if in the winter, if it drops by a mile per kilowatt hour, it's going to be suddenly a pretty unimpressive figure, isn't it? So we're talking about sort of fine margins here, but I kind of think that all these companies like Stellantis and Volkswagen, they're all catching up, and I think they're developing stuff on the hoof as they go along. And I think they're getting there in terms of the efficiency. And with the Citroen thing, they've sort of made this discovery that if they make it lighter, then the efficiency gets better. And I think the EC4 is 1,600 kilos, which for an electric car isn't particularly much. It's still more than the petrol and diesel is, but not by a huge amount. And I think that's a lot of the places where those efficiencies are being made. So I think they're all learning as we're going along.
Yeah. I think the other interesting thing for me that came out of looking at the 3008 is where Stellantis is pitching that car, where Peugeot is now seeing itself, because they were cheap and cheerful, weren't they? That's kind of what we would have bought a Peugeot for back in the day, and actually now they're very firmly pitching themselves as this another marketing speak allure, this alluring, but a premium brand, and they're in a price point with. Potentially they haven't, we don't know pricing on this yet, but I have heard, and I've, figures that are being bandied around a mid 40s. So you're looking at very firmly at, Tesla Model Y, you're looking at Kia EV6, you're looking at Audi e-tron, the Q4 e-tron. So it's an interesting move up market. It's got a very luxury interior, very comfortable, and it does feel nice inside. But I don't know, is that a big leap, do you think, for car buyers to kind of be cross-shopping from a Peugeot to an Audi?
Now, Ginny, you lived in Australia for a while, didn't you?
I did live in Australia for a while, Tom. Where are
Well,
we heading
well,
with this?
where's this
What have you
going?
well,
found
no.
out about me? It's not true. It wasn't me, and I didn't do that.
No, well, I think Peugeot was seen, or traditionally was seen, as quite a prestige brand in Australia. So
It's
the
not
cars
saying
were always very expensive.
it's clutching at straws, Tom.
Well, no, it's just that it might well be. I mean, you go to Africa and it's full of Peugeots that have lasted for ages, and they see it as a very high quality brand. And I don't know,
Yeah, I
maybe we
guess
just need to.
yeah, it's a good point. I think the Australia thing was anything European was seen as being massively premium. I shipped a Golf out there, a Golf GTI convertible when I was living out there, and honestly, people were just kind of like thought it was the most incredible thing ever. So I think there was a lot of that at the time, certainly when I was there. But yeah, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Great.
Mm,
Car companies can
mm,
reinvent themselves, but I just wonder whether it's easier to do that if you are a new brand coming in, a new entrant into the space, and you've not got that legacy behind you. So I
mm.
think that was going to be really interesting to see when pricing is finally revealed on that, what we're putting it up against in group tests and things. I think it could be a really interesting one.
Yeah.
So, Mike, you were in a slightly more, I think it's fair to say, glamorous part of France than I was. How was Paris?
Paris was fine. We got it was a bit hard because we arrived at the dark at Charles de Gaulle. We got bundled into some minibuses with blacked out windows and sort of driven round in circles for what felt like an hour till we arrived at this launch venue. So I didn't really know exactly where we were, but the next day we drove the Ami buggy, which is the kind of sold out version of the Ami with and it's sort of part fairground ride, part tent, part car. It's a bit of everything really. The doors kind of clunk with those that sort of metal bar that if you go on a fairground or a roller coaster, it kind of clunks back into. It's all a bit like that. And I've added a few things to the basic AMI to make it feel a little bit more kind of buggy, a bit outdoor. One of which is what our American friends would call a fanny pack on the steering wheel, where you'd normally have an airbag on a car. You've got a sort of piece of canvas bag, which they say to keep your keys and your phone in. I can only imagine that's while you're not driving, because you need both to kind of operate the car. So, but it was an interesting thing that has these kind of sort of canvas and sort of see-through plexiglass windows to keep it watertight, which we needed because it chucked it down. The mapping is on. It obviously doesn't have any sat nav, doesn't have anything really. It has a phone, and they gave us a Google Map route on it. So you click yes and okay. So it took us out of the hotel and down a sort of little country road, and it said your destination has been reached. I didn't realize you had to then press continue to go on to the next waypoint. And all I knew was it was just in the middle of France. I didn't know where we were. We'd arrived at night, and I thought if I turn left, I could very easily find myself on the autoroute back to Paris and shortcut to a French jail. So I didn't really know where I was, what I was doing. And I looked up and I realized I had a bin lorry behind me, which was about that far away from the back of the AMI, which, you know, you are the crumple zone in an AMI. And I was doing 28 miles an hour, and this thing was not giving way. There's three French binmans that really wanted their lunch, you know. So it was kind of scary, really. I was quite pleased to get in the EC4 and EC4X after lunch, really. But But can I just say before we go on,
was the sat nav an improve?
The sat nav was way better, yeah. But actually, the most interesting thing on the launch, funny, they sat me down. I sat at lunch and they said, "Oh, we've got this guy, the guy who's built the 48-volt hybrid version. We wanted you to speak to him." And I said, "Well, I don't want to let you down, but we only do anything with something with a plug in it." So they moved my seat at lunchtime, and I got sat next to these guys who are building an app called Eroots, and it sounds more interesting than it is. It's kind of like a Tesla-like driving experience. So you and I, we've all been there. We've all said, "I'm going to drive, 300 miles to a location. The charger I want to go to, I've got a rough idea of the charger I want to go to, but I've got no idea if that's going to be offline or someone's going to be using it until I get there, right?" What this does is like Tesla does. It has live display. So say I'm going to stop at Farnborough and charge up the 2 Instavolts there. I can tell as I'm driving and approaching that for the whole journey whether that's being used. So if one's being used, two's being used, and if both are being used, the navigation then reroutes you to another one. I mean, Tesla have had this for 10 years, so it's no great, secret really. But I mean, what the beauty of this is it obviously pulls together all the different charging points around Europe. So all the different, and it's just on screen at the same time. It's just brilliant. I just thought, it would just sort of break that. Unfortunately, it's only going to be Stellantis cars. But I did say to the guys, look, if you open this up to other people, I'd happily pay a subscription for something that was that good. And it all plays through CarPlay and Android Auto, so you don't have to rely on the sort of lousy OEM system.
That's what I was going to ask you, is does it play through CarPlay and Android Auto? Because it's just so key, that, isn't it? And because you put a brilliant thing on our Twitter feed about this, didn't you? Just about trying to find out what people actually use. Do people actually use the operating systems within the car? And actually, most of us are using Android Auto or CarPlay, aren't we?
There were a few people who replied and said, no, I'm sticking with the OEM one because it's really good. And when you sort of interrogate what they mean by really good, it's really clunky. You can't pre-program it until you're in the car. Then you've got to rely on that. And then you can't play your podcast or your music because you've got to come out of CarPlay. So, for all the technology in the world, we really I feel really behind on this dynamic charging. If we're going to get people to accept electric cars as not being quirky things that we've got to walk across a car park to go and find a charger, then we're going to need stuff like this, aren't we? Definitely.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. Yeah, I was reading the piece that you put up over on electrifying.com, and it does sound really interesting system. I think we're going to get it in end of the year, are we, here in the UK? October time, is that right? Good.
Absolutely.
I should look forward to that. So before this podcast becomes at risk of being sponsored by Stellantis, should we turn to Hyundai instead, Tom, and have a chat about you? What have you been?
So I went to drive the Kona Electric, the new version, which is, I mean, it looks a little bit like a facelift, but it's actually a bigger car. It's 15 centimeters longer, and that's all gone into the back. So it's a bit like the Kia Niro has more space in the back. So it's now a much more spacious car. It's got a proper sized boot and proper rear legroom, which it didn't have before. And although we loved the old Kona Electric, that was probably the thing that held it back for most family motorists. So it's now much more spacious. It's much nicer inside. And I drove the long range version, which they'd just got the WLTP, so the official range figures for it, and they actually put a sticker on the press pack because they've just come in the new figures. And the long range one's 321 miles, which is properly long.
Yeah. That's a pretty decent one. What's it drive like? Because I really like this car. It really wowed me when I saw it. I saw the early ones in a studio in Germany earlier this year, and I think they've done a great job with how it looks.
Yeah, well, I think that looks are, we all have our opinions, and I think it looks a bit weird, but it's very futuristic. I think the Kia is a better looking car, but we can all have our own opinions on that. But it drives very well. It's a car that's very competent. You're not going to have any complaints about the way it goes. What's interesting is, do you remember in the old car, it had like 200 horsepower going through the front wheels, and you'd pull away from a damp junction and it would screech.
It was a bit
scrabble.
scrabbly, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and they've killed it on this. They killed all that. It's gone. And I was talking to the engineer about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, we've just got much better computers, and they talk to each other in a much more efficient way now. So we can just so it feels much better from that point of view." So it's okay. I think that the we gave it 10 out of 10 before, and I was expecting this kind of miracle, and it wasn't quite a miracle. I think I personally would have the Kia, but I wouldn't blame anyone for having the Hyundai.
What do you think of how it looks, Mike? Are you in my camp or in Tom's camp?
No, I've got the slight disadvantage. I've not seen it in the metal. I've only seen it in the photos, and we all know that some cars look absolutely awful in photos and look great. The Lotus Electra probably being the biggest example I could say from this year. I'm not wild on it in the pictures. It looks a little RoboCop for me, but I'm going to reserve. Obviously I'm in the lukewarm water between fire and ice of you two, whether you like it or don't like it. So I'm going to plead the fifth, and I'm going to reserve my judgment until I've seen it in the metal. But I'm not. If I like it, I'm going to be surprised that I like it rather than disappointed that I don't like it, because I do. If that makes any sense. But yeah. But you love it, don't you? I mean, you love it.
Yeah, it's funny. I had an instant, oh my gosh, I really like this car. But also I thought the interior was such a step up. I think that's what really impressed me, was that it just felt like a much nicer cabin to be in. And it felt like a place that I would enjoy being in as I drove along. But I can't wait to drive it. But it's interesting you say that thing about how some cars just look completely different when you see them in the metal. And I had that a bit yesterday because I went to get a first UK drive in the Jeep Avenger.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so little. It's so cute. It's because you've driven it, Tom, on the international launch, and I've seen your video, and I've obviously seen lots of photography of it. But when you actually see it, it's a lot smaller than it looks, isn't it? Did you get that sense as well?
Absolutely, because they say, "Oh, it's a city car," and you think, "Well, that's ridiculous. You can't have SUVs in the city." But actually, it's city car size. It's like the size of a Fiat Panda, but tall. I really like that car. I mean, it's got no room in the back, and the boot's small, and it's not that fast. But compare it to other small cars, and it's perfectly fine, except for the price, which isn't very small.
It's not got a small price. I don't know how much we can say. I think it's all under embargo. The video goes out, I think, next week. Want to say the 16th? No, that's not soon enough. 19th, sometime next week anyway, with all those details in. But I don't know. I that question, right? Let's come back to that question that I said at the top. When is a Jeep not a Jeep? I couldn't think of a punchline to that one. I don't know if you've come up with a punchline, Tom. You're good at that kind of stuff. No. But I think when is Jeep not a Jeep for me? So I've owned Jeeps in the past. I've had a Grand Cherokee. My dad's owned Jeep Wranglers. He shipped a couple over from the US. I've done loads of off-road stuff in Jeeps. I've done the Rubicon Trail. I've driven them in deserts. And the word that I always think about when I think about a Jeep is really rugged. It's that rugged and tough and go anywhere, do anything. So this is a massive reinvention. And I know not that there will be, I know there are lots of people out there who just don't like this. When is a Jeep not a Jeep? When it's got two-wheel drive and it's basically based on the same bits underneath, the same foundations as Vauxhalls and Peugeots. It's little Vauxhalls and Peugeots. In fact, I don't know. Can car brands reinvent themselves? I guess is my question for you. Is it all right for them to do that? Are they allowed to just go, well, that's great and that's what we were, but this is better for our cities and this is better for where we're going? Personally, I think they can, but I think there's probably people out there that don't agree with me. Thoughts, discuss, team, Mike?
I think there's always going to be a degree of people, traditionalists, who will always say that the Jeep needs to be an off-roader. They needs to be doing this. Well, I was talking to Olivier Francois, who's the CEO of Fiat, and he said, and sort of marketing at Stellantis as well, and he said that they want to make Jeep more Jeep. So, but they want to keep the essence of it. But so you won't get a rebadged Citroen as a Jeep, that kind of thing. So I think you can reinvent a marque, because stuff goes out of date, doesn't it? Nobody wants Grand Cherokees anymore, do they? I mean, maybe North America, there's still a sizable market for that kind of thing. But if you want to be a global brand, you've got to offer stuff that's a bit different. I'm struggling to think of a brand that has kind of entirely reinvented itself, and I don't think you could with Jeep. But there's enough sort of design DNA that they could roll that out into sort of funkier things. They're talking about making an electric Wrangler, aren't they? So, and I think that would be a really good car to have in their range.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
the one I'm excited about is the Wagoneer. So they're bringing, of course, that the Wagoneer mark. The 400-mile range apparently. I don't know, Tom. What do you reckon? You've seen it as well. Yeah.
I think you can reinvent a brand. There are marketing people would call them proof points of the essence of the brand. And if you look at Mini, for example, a Mini is no longer Mini. It's not a city car. There's a 4x4 version. But what is it that makes a Countryman or the new Mini Electric a Mini? It's the way it drives and some of the styling around it. And I think with Jeep, they've got a small city car. It does have not what I call off-road ability, but what most people will do is, can you drive up a rough track, which you can do perfectly well in the Avenger, and that's all most people expect. And it's got a settings, hasn't it, for ice and snow and mud that just change the way things are. And I think it's a clever reinvention, because they either go after Land Rover and go very posh, or they just make something which is a little more rugged, perfect for potholed British roads and the occasional wet field when you're coming out of a festival or something. I think it's perfectly possible to do that.
Well, we would love to know what you think. Just let us know in the comments below. Does the thought of a small Jeep city car, which is what it is really, does that really disappoint you, or do you think that actually it's great that they're going down a different route? So yeah, do let us know what you think. We could probably do a kilowatt full hour on all the events we've been covering this week, but should we just turn to the news and just stories that are floating around? Is there anything that's caught your eye this week in the wider news? Mike, do you want to kick this one off?
Pick up something end of last week, which we didn't really have time to discuss, and that's good charging, bad charging. Good charging is the fact that there's the NEC has the UK's biggest rapid charging hub now, public one. It's 30 150 kilowatt hour chargers and 150 7 kilowatt hour chargers. Now, I've been to the NEC for events before and tried to charge, and they had like 4 units, which nobody knew how they worked or anything. It was terrible. So this is a really good breakthrough, I think, in those kind of things. It's centrally located. It's where 3 or 4 motorways meet and everything. So that's good. It's operated by BP Pulse, and it looks like it's going to be, a great place to sort of stop and charge up. On the flip side of that, I was on the way to Heathrow for the Citroen launch. I had to stop and charge up. There's a single BP Pulse in a car park in the middle of nowhere, just outside Farnborough. It's one of those, and it worked. It was fine. It charged my car up. It did the job. But it was one of those ones that had as a parking eye car park. There was a nearby Harvester or whatever it was. It was absolutely chucking it down. So I got soaked plugging it in. Then I had to walk 300 meters across to this Harvester to go and put my number plate in. And I was behind a group of 8 who were trying to argue whether they'd booked a table or not. So I was 2 or 3 minutes, or longer than that, probably waiting there to get to this terminal so I could type my number plate in. And then, of course, soaked getting back to the car. And just thinking, this definitely isn't the future. And I'm hoping this is kind of the old world, because that used to be there 4 years ago, that charger, when I first bought my i3.
Yeah.
So I've been using that a long time. And it was just the contrast between this lovely BP Pulse hub that's just on the NEC. It's got solar canopies, it's got cafes, loos. The sense it is the future. But it was just brought back down to earth, thinking, we'll get the early adopters to put up with walking across a car park and queuing up in a harvester, but we're not going to get my neighbours, my parents, or anything like that doing it. So it's moving in the right direction, but there's always a reminder that of the past that was there. So that's my week in charging.
I actually think there's a good argument for just getting rid of a lot of those old chargers, because we all know of the chargers that are out there that are not looked after, or that are in places where actually it's actually not that safe. And I think that actually does such a disservice to the fact that we are getting some decent infrastructure. So I think you could probably go through all the charging infrastructure in the UK and get rid of maybe 10% of it, because it's not really fit for purpose anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Which is what they've done at Heathrow. So all the chargers at Heathrow that were 7 kilowatt they're offline. They don't work,
Really?
so they're presumably going to replace them with something new and shiny. Yeah.
Sorry, I've got to just mention this, Jenny. There's a line at the bottom of the BP press release, which is brilliant. It says, gigahubs are typically located in high demand areas such as airports and on motorways. BP Pulse has already opened gigahubs at Gatwick Airport and in Kettering. I just thought that was an odd choice.
I mean,
I'm trying to think whether
Kettering
it's it's a lovely place, I'm sure, but but yeah, it just seemed an odd choice. Two things to pick out: Gatwick Airport and Kettering. Yeah, so
if anyone in Kettering is, if anyone in Kettering's listening to the podcast, could you just let us know in the comments?
What's there? Should we be heading there?
Are we? What? I feel like we're missing out. I'm getting FOMO. I'm getting Kettering FOMO. So come on, tell us what's happening.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Tom, what are you chatting?
On our YouTube videos, if we do a review of something like a BYD or an MG, there's always a couple of people who write in capitals about Chinese cars and supporting the Chinese government and generally having a rant. Now, I don't know enough about it to get upset or to make a comment on it, really. But the EU have today launched a probe, which is always a good word, into the electric car industry and what's coming from China, because I think some of the European car makers have said this just isn't fair. Because basically the problem is that if you are a Chinese buyer and you import a electric car from a European maker, you get taxed at 15%. Whereas if an electric car comes here, it only gets taxed at 10%. And they say that the Chinese electric car makers are subsidized by the Chinese government. And therefore, they'll just make the cars cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until the European car industry disappears. And then they've got a monopoly. So there's a probe now to see what's going on. Now, what the interesting bit of it is that the main people who are moaning are Stellantis, because they don't have car factories apart from one Jeep one, which they're going to close in China. The likes of Tesla and BMW and Polestar, which is kind of a bit
China. Well, they're kind of Chinese owned anyway, aren't they?
Yeah. So they make cars there. They haven't got a problem with it, or they're not making such a fuss about it. So it's a really interesting one. And the next Mini Electric is going to be built in China at the start, but then it will move to Oxford. So we can be competitive. It's just, I don't know. It's a difficult one.
It is, but I just kind of think that we don't do enough generally, I think, in Europe to support the car industry. If you look at what Biden's introduced in the US with that Inflation Reduction Act, which is massive subsidies to support production of electric vehicles and adoption of electric vehicles in there, and adding taxation and taxes onto cars that are imported. And then you do look at the Chinese car industry, and that has been massively heavily subsidized, as you say, and supported by the Chinese government. Isn't it just about putting us on a level playing field? Because that's better for the consumer. There's part of me that just thinks, don't punish other countries for actually doing some good stuff. Don't make it harder because that's just car buyers in the end that are going to suffer. Have a word instead. Put pressure on, European governments to, to support what you're doing more, to give you tax breaks for factories, to build some more stuff, or do what, again, other European car brands have done, get out to China, make some joint venture partnerships and explore, opening factories there. I just kind of think that whole kind of, it seems a bit backwards to me, rather than thinking about actually what's going to be best for the car industry generally, globally, and consumers as well. But I'm sure they
What
would agree
the
with me.
what the French are going to do apparently, which is really clever, and you'll like this, Ginny, is that they are adjusting their grants for electric cars depending on the CO2 produced in the car's manufacture.
Yeah, that's
So
great.
this will affect the Chinese because a lot of their power that they use to make batteries and things comes from coal power stations.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe, it tends to be much greener. And of course, shipping cars from China isn't particularly green either.
Yeah.
So that kind of evens it out. And I think doing it on that sort of basis, something was solid that's going to actually make a difference is quite clever.
I think, well, that I think is absolutely brilliant, and it ties in with all the work that we've been doing around our Green Heroes, which is really looking at car makers and how they produce the cars, given that so much of the emissions of an overall car's life cycle are emitted during those early manufacturing processes and the supply chain. So yeah, I think that's a brilliant idea. So I'm going to take us now from this kind of lofty heights, even of lofty heights of thinking
lights.
about the environment and protectionism. And I'm just going to ask you two a question.
Yep.
Do you feel like real men because you drive electric cars? Because apparently a lot of men don't, according to the Daily Mail.
Really? That's
So,
surprising. It was such a
as two
trusted
men,
outlet.
trusted news source.
Yeah.
Have you ever questioned your masculinity because you're in an electric car? Has that ever flashed across your mind for a moment? No.
There was a survey a few years ago about if women prefer men who drive V8s or Toyota Priuses, and this was in the States, and they did a survey thing on a dating app or something, and they said that women preferred the Prius man.
Exactly. So, and this is another one of those surveys, but it's actually some data and research that came from, we love Texas University, where I imagine the concept of what the real man is quite strong. But they were asking a sort of research group, would they respect themselves if they didn't live up to being a real man? And around 40% said no, they wouldn't. And one of the things that they held up as not being traditionally masculine and not being a thing that a real man does is to drive an electric car. But then that group presumably was in Texas, so I'm not sure what that's actually. I think it says more about Texas.
An oil-producing state, yeah.
Yes, yeah. But I thought that was quite interesting. So that was my that was the Daily Mail headline that grabbed me this week. The latest bit of really well-researched, well-put-together journalism. So,
yeah.
Right then, on that point, what's going on? Have we got a Karma week next week? Are you back driving the desk, Mike?
Yeah, back driving the desk. I've got a 2024 model year Jaguar I-Pace coming in towards the end of next week. I don't know how different that is to the current ones, but it's quite. I mean, obviously on the background of it, going in 18 months' time, isn't it? So it'll be it's kind of last hurrah, I suspect. But so I'm looking forward to getting that. But otherwise, driving the old desk for most of the week. Yeah.
You're driving the desk, Tom. What are you up to?
Well, I'm going to Sweden to drive the Zeekr X.
Oh, yeah.
And it's been the weirdest press invite I've ever had, because normally the PR person, they ring you up and say, would you like to come on this, or you get some details. This was kind of a mysterious email that said, come and drive the new car in Stockholm on these dates. And then you had to download an app and fill in your details, and then you get something saying, we will be in touch.
Wow.
And I haven't heard anything. So it's quite possible it's some sort of elaborate kidnap plot and you might never see me again. But if not, it'll be quite an interesting car. I think it's Geely. It's based on the same platforms as Volvos and things. So it's if I don't get kidnapped and it's a genuine thing, then I'll be interested to find out what it's like and report back. But otherwise, goodbye, everybody.
Well, good luck with that. I really hope that you're here for the next episode of the Kilowatt Half Hour next week, just to fill us in. And if not, it's been a real pleasure knowing you and working with you.
Please come back. Please come
And
back.
on that note, please come back. I think it's time to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on the Kilowatt Half Hour, brought to you from all the gang at Electrifying. If you have anything that you think we should be covering, any comments, do let us know in the comments below. And it's goodbye from us. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.